Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Radiant Central, and I'm your host Natasha St. Michael, and thank you so much for joining me. So today I want to give my opinion on the 80-10-10 diet. I get a lot of requests to give my opinion on this diet, so that's what I'll do. For those that don't know what the 80-10-10 diet is, it's created by a man named Doug Graham, and it's a raw vegan diet, and it's a high carbohydrate raw vegan diet. And 80-10-10 represents the ratio between carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So it's 80% carbohydrates, 10% fats, 10% proteins. The one thing that I want to mention before I go on into my opinion on the diet is that one thing that I see a lot is people following someone else's interpretation of this diet. I see this a lot in sort of the online world, is that people don't read the book. They're not reading the diet, but they're following someone else's interpretation of it. And sometimes it's a misinterpretation. I find with this diet is that a lot of times people think it's a fruitarian diet or an exclusively all fruit diet or a high fruit diet. And if you actually read the book, Doug Graham does emphasize the importance of eating vegetables and even the importance of eating some nuts and seeds and some fats, some oils, okay? That it's not exclusively a fruitarian diet. It's not exclusively an all-fruit diet. And this is something that it's important to read the book so you really get the first-hand information and not someone's interpretation of it, okay? Number one. Another thing that's overlooked in this diet is that Doug Graham does mention throughout the book as well that the 80-10-10 ratio between carbohydrates, fats, and proteins is an average. It's not something that someone should be following exclusively every single day, but it's an average over maybe a week. That some days someone will be eating 80-10-10, whereas other days they might be eating even more carbohydrates and even less proteins and fats, and other days they might be eating even more proteins and fats. That if you were to calculate the amounts of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats over a week, it would come out to being 80-10-10. But it's not something that is regimented every single day. Okay, and I find that too, people that are interpreting the diet never mention, and that's an important factor as well. So always read the book. Important to get first-hand information. Now, onto my opinion of the diet. Well, one thing that with the diet, it is a high carbohydrate diet, and I find with the 80-10-10 diet is that it's great short-term as a cleanse. I think that would be great for doing for a few days, or great to do maybe for a week or even a few weeks or even a month or two. Fine, no problem. And especially if someone does well on a high carbohydrate diet, it's definitely worth trying it out. In sort of the diet world, there's always going to be people that are fighting over high carbohydrate diets and low carbohydrate diets, right? There's always the high carbs people and the no carbs people. And what I see being a health coach is that everyone's different. Some people do great being on a high carbohydrate diet. Other people do terribly. It's just, that's how it is. And I think there's always going to be this debate as to which one is better. And because not everyone does well in the same type of diet. So if someone does really well on a high carbohydrate diet and they want to try out a raw vegan diet, then trying out the 80-10 diet would be a great step. But one thing I want to mention is that sometimes the ratio of proteins and fats might be a little bit too low. Those percentages of having 10% fat and 10% protein, not everyone does well on it. And I would say over the long term, a lot of times people are going to run into issues. Some of the symptoms that you're running into an issue of not getting enough proteins and fats would be hormonal issues. Okay, we build our hormones off of the fats that we're ingesting, and a lot of times if someone's doing a very low-fat diet is that over time they might notice that either their period stops or they're not ovulating, or they have a very low sex drive, things like that. Other symptoms of having a low-fat or low-protein diet, you might notice that the quality of your skin and your nails and your hair, it becomes dry, it becomes brittle. It's just not as lustrous as it used to be, not as things like that. Sometimes other issues might be inflammatory issues, maybe joint pain, things like that. So if you're starting to notice that you're having some issues after doing the 80-10-10 diet for a while, try increasing the ratios of fats and proteins. And you don't have to increase it so much. Sometimes it's just increasing it to like 15% or 20% of either fat or proteins or both, to see if that helps. And if you're increasing it up to 20% of proteins or 20% of fats, you're still keeping a very high carbohydrate diet, but you're just bumping it up just a little bit, just to see if your body responds better to that. So I do like to say it's important to experiment with different things, you know, that a lot of times people say do the 80-10-10 diet, and if it's not working for you, you're doing something wrong. And you know, sometimes I don't agree with that. I think sometimes you need to adjust things and try different things out to find something that really works for you, that's tailor-made for you. So that's something to try out. Another thing too that I find is that the high carbohydrates, having fruits as the source or the main source of carbohydrates, can be sometimes a little bit too much fruits for people, and sometimes they forget that they can actually get a lot of those carbohydrates from vegetables. So if you're trying it out and you're just feeling like, whoa, this is a lot of fruit and I don't feel so good having so much fruit, try and have more vegetables, have more greens in your diet, more all different types of vegetables. You know, they could be raw or even cooked, and that too can make a big difference. Also too, some people do better to add in some cooked beans and legumes or some cooked whole grains. They're still keeping a very high carbohydrate diet, but by adding in some of the cooked beans and legumes or cooked whole grains, they're adding in more minerals into their diet, and just another source of carbohydrates that's not as damp as having so much fruit, and not as high in fructose as the fruit has. Some people are sensitive to fructose, you know, that having too much fruit is just not good. That if they add in some cooked grains or some cooked beans and legumes, they feel much better, and it just balances things out. That they're not completely cutting out the fruit, but they're just incorporating some other foods, some more variety in the diet, and they're still maintaining their high carbohydrate diet, and they feel great. These are just different adjustments that you can try out. You know, the main thing is that everyone's different. And what's most important is that you follow what works for your body, not what someone's telling you to do, not what your friend is doing, but what works for you. And if something feels good but it doesn't feel great, then keep doing adjustments. Keep trying different things out, and eventually you will find what works. Now, have I ever tried the 80-10-10 diet? Yeah, I actually tried it twice. As most people know, I did a raw vegan diet for about 4 years. And during that time, I tried the 80-10-10 diet once while I was living in Montreal, Canada, over the winter months, and also when I was traveling in Thailand, and that was over the rainy season. And it was very interesting for me to see is that I actually did better on the 80-10-10 diet in Montreal, Canada, over the winter months. And in Montreal, our winters, they go down to like minus 30 degrees Celsius. I mean, it is cold. But because you're indoors a lot of the time, or most of the time, and you're in indoor heating, and the indoor heating makes the environment very dry, that I found being on the 80-10-10 diet was kind of a good balance, because the 80-10-10 diet, having a lot of fruits in it, and it's an all raw diet, it's a very damp diet. And so if you're living in an environment where the climate is dry, even if it's indoor heating that's making it so dry, it could help be a nice balance to that. But I found when I was actually traveling in the tropics and in the rainy season, I did terribly eating an 80-10-10 diet. It was just too damp. And being in an environment where it was so humid on top of the dampness of the diet, it just didn't feel good. I felt my joints were very achy, and I found it irritated my bladder having so much fruit, and I just didn't feel good. That I actually think that the best place to be doing an 80-10-10 diet would be more in like a desert area, or in a place where you're in indoor heating all the time. That can actually work, more so than being in a very humid or wet tropical environment where there's a lot of mold growing and it's just maybe just too wet. And if you find that you want to be doing a high carbohydrate diet and a raw vegan diet, you can follow the 80-10-10 diet, but I would recommend adding in some of those cooked whole grains and some cooked beans and legumes in a very humid environment, because that could help to sort of counter some of that humidity or some of that dampness. So that's my view of the 80-10-10 diet. Some people do well on it, some people don't. If you do well on it, great. If you don't, then move on and try something else. All right, so I'm wishing you guys a super fabulous day, and I'll see you again soon.